From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
This is a part of our series of 4 members of Congress on great American presidents, and we're very grateful that our expert is willing to have a little meeting for staff members and others who were not included in this members only last night to hear something about the preeminent expert really on the man who's widely referred to as the father of our Constitution. Anyhow, James Madison held 3 different public leadership positions, each for 8 years. 8 years as a member of Congress, followed by 8 years as Secretary of State to Thomas Jefferson, then finally 2 terms, or 8 years as President of the United States, and even after that, 8 years as rector of the University of Virginia after Jefferson's death. His submission of the so-called Virginia Plan, which is part of the things that we have on display today, I think still in the members' room that was brought out, outlined the 3 branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, and served as a foundation of the Constitution, as did his notes on the Federal Constitutional Convention, which are also on display. So there's a whole lot of original manuscript documents, of which we have the mother lode here in the library, will be kept on display for any of you who want to visit them in the members' room afterwards. Madison also helped push 12 amendments of the Constitution through Congress in its first year, 10 being ratified by the states, composing the Bill of Rights. He was the longest living of the Founding Fathers, dying just 10 years after Jefferson and Adams did in 1836 at the age of 85. Now, the library's 3 buildings on Capitol Hill, as most of you know, are named respectfully for Jefferson and Adams, and the most recent one for Madison himself, located just across Independence Avenue, and it is the nation's official memorial to this great and unique president. So we're delighted to have with us today the expert navigator of the enormously rich and complex Madison legacy, the Stanford professor, Pulitzer-prize winner, Jack Rakove. So we're moderating today's discussion will be Jim Hutson, director, as many of you know, of the library's Manuscript division, and himself a scholar, an eminent scholar of the Founding Fathers. I know that if Jack Rakove has worked a lot with Bud Balin, who's on our Scholars Council and was one of the great scholars of the American Founding Fathers. Jim Hutson worked with Ed Morgan, who is another great scholar of this period. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jack Rakove and Jim Hutson to tell us all about James Madison.
Thank you. What we're going to do, I will ask Jack. I'll question Jack for about a half an hour, and then we'll open the floor to the audience for some questions. I will try to ask some of the questions that were presented last night. The format of these programs, which have been so successful, is that David Rubenstein, who is, as you well know, a local philanthropist and businessman who's been very generous to the library, has been funding these, and he's also a superb interviewer and a man of great depth of knowledge about virtually everything, including American history. He's asked questions of the visiting scholars, and again for about 30 minutes, and then turn the floor over to the members of Congress who have asked questions. And they've been very good questions. I thought there were some really good ones last night. So I thought one good question was about Madison's religion. We had two documents on display last night. Madison's document in which he had successfully amended the Virginia Bill of Rights, changing the terminologies from full toleration of religion to free exercise. And then a famous memorandum that he wrote in 1785 and against a program promoted by Patrick Henry and George Washington, of which George Washington approved, called a General Assessment Program in Virginia, where everybody would be taxed to support the church of their own choice. If they didn't want to pay it to the church, they could pay the money to education. It seemed like a pretty good idea at the time, but Madison wrote a very powerful indictment of the scheme. The question Jack was asked, he answered it in two ways. One was, what was Madison's religion? And you might ask, how did that differ really from Jefferson or Adams? Or, yeah.
So it is a good question. In some ways, it's a puzzling question. And what makes it puzzling is the fact that Madison is deeply private about what his religion was. So we know that Madison grew up within the Church of England, and we know that he continued to worship, modestly or moderately within it. But my sense is that he writes very little bit about it. His idea and the fact that he says so little about what he believed, the fact that he doesn't, profess the kind of the central doctrinal tenets of Christianity, I think suggests pretty strongly to me that, like many members of his generation, he was moving or had moved in the direction of deistical, or you could say Socinian convictions, meaning that he know as much respect as he might have paid to Jesus as a moral prophet. That would make him very much like Thomas Jefferson. He probably had radical doubts about Jesus' divinity. But the key part of this, and perhaps this is where Jim was going to go, is to ask how Madison's privacy about his personal belief relates to his deeper understanding about the place that religion should play in American culture and American politics. And here what I think tends to unite Jefferson and Madison, though with somewhat different attitudes, is that I think both believe very muchly that religion was essentially a private matter. It was something you wanted to preserve as arguably as the first of the rights we possess as individuals. But there was best practice the more it was left to the private sphere, and the left it was regulated, supported, enforced, moderated in any way by government. So I think the way in which it's tough to answer definitively what did Madison think about the nature of divinity, salvation, etc., it's actually tied pretty closely to his public philosophy, to the idea that what makes religion really important is the idea that it truly, what makes the free exercise of religion, let's say freedom of conscience and the free exercise of religion, so important is that that right or those rights really recognize what I might call even the sovereign autonomy of the individual. And then secondly, that if you disestablish religion, which Madison sets out to do, and what Jim said a few minutes ago about his opposition to the General Assessment Bill in Virginia back in the mid-1780s, I think to me that's the first great example of, a very powerful example of what the whole American theory of the nature of government would be. Because in a sense what you're saying is here's a religion, an area that's far too important and far too controversial for any state to renounce its authority over. I mean, historically, particularly let's say in 16th, 17th, 18th century Europe, it would be crazy or foolhardy to say that the state has no authority to regulate religion, or for that matter, no authority to promote it. So I think their radical position was, no, in fact, the opposite. Nothing would better demonstrate what it means to live under a government of delegated powers than to say, here's an area that states have always regulated, and we're going to privatize it. It will become an area of voluntary activity, both for individuals and both for members of churches. So I think beyond Madison's individual convictions, there's this really important, critically important set of issues about how does your position both on free exercise and on disestablishment correlate to larger theories of Republican government.
Yes, and the one remark Jack made last night that I don't think registered with the audience was that Madison also thought that free exercise would promote political stability. How was that going to happen,
Right.
Jack?
Yes, good follow-up. Right? So that's an interesting point of difference, I think, between Jefferson and Madison. So I think Jefferson, after the Revolution, got somewhat disillusioned by the kind of revival of revivalist religion in America that historians called the Second Great Awakening. Jefferson, I think, had said, back in the 1780s, Christians will all be Unitarians. That turns out not to be true. And of course, there's the growth of religious enthusiasm in the form, say, of the great spread of the Baptist and Methodist denominations was something that actually troubled Jefferson in various ways. Madison was much more philosophical about this because as he suggests in Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, for those who remember those great texts, the great diversity, the great source of security for liberty will be to have a diversity of interest. And the best example of how diversity of interest will operate will lie in the realm of religion. So I think Madison is much more philosophical. The argument here is that, particularly at the national level, or more likely at the national level than the state level, the larger, the more complex, the more diverse a society is, the more difficult it will be to form what he called fascist majorities. Majorities who would rule in defiance of the public good, but also of private rights. So Madison saw in the fertility of Protestant disputation, if I can use that expression, in 19th century America. My theory is if just turn Protestants loose to read the Bible, or this is my version of Madison's theory, just turn them loose to read the Bible, and they'll find lots of things to disagree about, which in fact has happened. And their disagreements will actually be a source of liberty because it will prevent the formation of what Madison calls fascist majorities. So again, you see the link between how he thinks about religion and how he thought about public life, political life more generally.
One more question. George Washington and many of Madison's colleagues believed that religion was a source of stability in another way. In
Right.
Washington's farewell address, he talks about religion being an indispensable support for political prosperity. That is to say, it would promote a moral, responsible population. Did Madison buy into these kind of views or not?
That's a tough question. It's one of the things, not unlike a couple other sensitive topics, Madison's thoughts on race, where he's fairly careful and doesn't reveal all that much. I'm not sure he would go as far as Washington went. There are a few passages, particularly in his writings from 1787, if you remember the argument from Federalist 10, or if you look at the antecedent documents, which are, by the way, out on display, in the room, back there, the vices of the political system, and I think also in the letter, no, maybe not in the letter to Washington, but in the letter to Jefferson. So when Madison reflects on religion, he does share a certain prejudice against what was called in the 17th and 18th century priestcraft. He's suspicious of organized religion, and he's not wholly convinced that religion will serve as an effective brake, B-R-A-K-E, on the vicious impulses, the fascist impulses of individuals. I mean, I'd like to think on his better days he was probably optimistic about it, but he probably was not wholly convinced of it. So.
Well, one final question. The last question asked last night, the questioner was trying, again, concerning religion and public policy, was talking about the Federalist, somehow they're reflecting Calvinistic views. What he meant, I think, was the kind of wickedness of the general population. Did Madison see this in the 1780s, going what was going on in state legislatures? Is that was that question completely off base or not?
No, it's not off base at all, because I mean, the whole basis, the founding basis of Madison's political theory, or part of what makes Madison the creative political thinker he was, is that he takes the conception, the kind of well-entrenched conception that if you want to have a republic, you need virtuous citizens, and virtuous citizens means the ability to subordinate private interest to public good. So Madison effectively, by 1787, tosses that notion out. He says, in effect, Americans are like other people. We act on the basis of opinion, we act on the basis of passion. Perhaps most important, we act on the basis of interest. We're self-interested, we're prejudiced, we have pride in our own opinions, whether or not those opinions are well-formed or not. He thinks about it psychologically. The tougher part of this, and the hard question to answer definitively, is could you elide, at least within the religious context, is can you elide this notion about opinion, passion, and self-interest and the self-serving nature of our political behavior with sin? And there is at least one, there's a book on Madison's political theory by a guy named Garrett Sheldon, who argues that actually, well, if you push deeply Madison's notion of self-interested behavior, selfishness, etc., in the end, maybe isn't that far from I don't know if I want to say an original sin conception of human frailty, but it's not radically divorced from it. I don't know. I mean, it's a plausible argument. On the other hand, Madison does not talk about it in terms of sinfulness. So
right. I was thinking about state legislators cheating debtors, creditors.
Okay,
right. A major issue. And, let's get to the Constitution. Madison served in the Confederation Congress. For people who perhaps don't remember from their history books, what were the Articles of Confederation like, and what was the problem with them?
Right. So the critical, what really, by the way, actually, I am Mr. Articles of Confederation on the site. That's to say, I have 2 chapters on the drafting of the Confederation in my first book, so something I've thought about for a long time. And not many people would want to make that claim, so I'm proud to be able to do it. So the Articles were drafted back in the mid-1770s. Congress sends them out to the states in November 1777, right after the Battle of Saratoga. They're not ratified until 1781 because of Maryland and its interest in Western lands. That too complicated a story to tell here. But they take effect, and as soon as they take effect, Madison is actually the chair. I'm not sure he's the chair, but he's part of a 3-man committee of Congress that's designed to ask how are we actually going to make the Confederation work. Madison took a pretty bleak view of the Confederation from the start. He said if we have delinquent states that aren't doing their duty towards what Congress has asked them to do, we ought to have some authority to compel or coerce the states to comply with their federal obligations. His idea was, since all the states are on the seaboard, if you actually had an adequate navy, you just park a frigate or 2 outside the local port. It'd be tough for New Jersey, but for every other state, it would work pretty well, and kind of shut off their commerce until they did the right thing. It wasn't a very happy political solution to the problem. But beyond that, Madison does start thinking pretty critically about the whole nature of the federal relationship. And the key point that you or we collectively ought to understand is the basic mechanism for the Articles of Confederation to work was that Congress would propose recommendations, requisitions, and resolutions to the states. The states were expected to comply legally through the force of ordinary law. Congress could not pass statutes, so the states would have to comply through the mechanisms of ordinary law and using their own judgment as to how best to implement these measures, carry the national project, whatever it was, forward. And that's the system that breaks down, and you find Madison thinking both in 1782, 1783, when he's been in Congress for a couple of years, and then again when he prepares for the Philadelphia Convention. He comes back and he attacks this notion of voluntary compliance of the states. And he comes to understand, I actually think I've written about this, and I'm writing about it some more, that Madison actually has a kind of what we would now call a game theoretic analysis of federalism. Meaning he thinks strategically about how the states will act vis-a-vis national measures. And he comes up with a set of arguments to explain why, well, states have very different interests, so we can't expect them to comply uniformly. Each state will have politicians who will want to run, or who will find it, he calls them courtiers of popularity, who want to oppose national measures for their own reasons. I now call this running against Washington. And third, in a system like this, even where the states have a common interest, doubts about each other's compliance will be a net drag on the whole system. Why should I go first until I see what other states are doing? And so think about this in terms of modern economics or political science. It's essentially a game, it's what I call a quasi-crypto proto game theoretic mode of reasoning. So he thinks, I mean, I think first he has the observations back when he's serving as a delegate in the early 1780s, and then when he thinks more systematically about this on the eve of the convention, he formulates his position. And by the way, well, you can't see it, it's what's on display, but if you go look at the vices of the political system, you know, again, which is one of the documents back here, then look it up online. Go to item 7. You know, if you're really serious about this, write down item 7, vices of the political system. And look at Madison's analysis. You see he goes from what's essentially a historic analysis of what went wrong and what we've learned since the articles were drafted to the three game theoretic propositions I just mentioned. Then he says, this will never fail to render federal measures abortive. So if that's true, then it leads to the idea that if you can't work through the states, what you need to do is give the national government legal authority over individuals.
And legal authority to the thing that maybe this often we all find surprising is Madison's proposal, or passionate belief that the national government ought to have a veto of every state law. Right?
Right. So, something many of us have written about. What, you want me to say something about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean,
okay,
but isn't that a key? That's one of his key proposals in the federal for the federal Constitution, and it doesn't. It falls flat. But he tried to work that into the Bill of Rights then again, didn't he?
In a kind of reduced, modified. Right. So the key. Okay, so the second key thing is really, in some ways, comes out of David Rubenstein's first question, which is. You know, how do you think about Madison as father of the Constitution? He loses a lot of issues, but on the other hand, he sets the stage for the whole discussion. So the other thing the other item that I think most scholars agree was really provocative, but also both deeply radical and deeply reactionary in Madison's thinking on the eve of the convention was, as Jim said, the idea of having a congressional negative on state laws, which you could use for either or hopefully both of two purposes. One would be to allow Congress to protect itself against interfering legislation from the states. So let's assume this, let's just assume randomly that the states might not like a particular piece of legislation, say the Affordable Care Act or whatever. Take a non-trivial example. They might very well pass laws that would, either not comply with it or actually try to interfere with it. So Madison felt that in that case, the national government should have the authority to negative, meaning to veto, state laws, meaning the states would no longer have any claim to sovereignty in any sense of the term under that condition. And then secondly, and more interestingly, from our vantage point, Madison also felt that power vested in the national government could also be used to protect individuals and minorities within the states against unjust legislation. So it would have two purposes. One would be to kind of promote national policy, prevent the states from interfering, but the other would be to enable the national government to intervene within the states individually and to do so in behalf of or in protection of rights, which is why, actually, Jim, it's one reason why I like to say that in some ways the most Madisonian part of the Constitution is the 14th Amendment, which was ratified 32 years after his death, because depending on how you read Section 1, I read it broadly, but the due process, equal protection, privilege, and immunities clause of the 14th Amendment are, in a sense, a kind of latter-day Madisonian device to deal with legislation within the states that works against the protection.
Especially the term, though, that the federal government will have the power to enforce these in the 14th Amendment.
Well, right.
But this is, as you point out, a very radical proposal that probably never had a chance of passing or never would have passed in America.
Yeah, no, it was pretty doubtful, although, it's tried twice. The second time, the defeat is narrower than the first. But it's also, to me, it's very hard to understand how Madison, coming from a southern state with somewhat complicated attitudes about race and slavery, why he ever could have conceived that the states would accept it. So maybe one way to think about this is that, regardless of whether or not they had a good chance of adoption, it shows, how Madison was thinking. I mean, the key point we made here is that when Madison makes a set of proposals, he's really enlarging in a pretty substantial way the agenda of reform. Nobody before 1787 had been thinking about what do we do in terms of strengthening the national government, how might we use that occasion to deal with problems of government within the individual states. So that's a big step forward.
Madison's proposal for the new government was called the Virginia plan. It was introduced by the governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph, in the convention, May 29th, I believe. It was, again, I think the members of the audience may know a lot, perhaps know this, but it was an unusual, not unusual, but a plan that, again, did not even come close to, it doesn't resemble what finally emerged. The House of Representatives in this plan would elect members of the Senate who would have been recommended by the state legislatures, and the two would then, the House and Senate together, would elect the president. Mm-hmm. That wasn't that unusual because in some of the states, the lower house appointed the upper house, the council. Right. But still, it was so it would not have surprised the delegates. The interesting thing about that Virginia plan, and Jack and I were talking about this before we went on air here, was the Senate. And I know he's working on this right now, but tell us a little bit about what Madison actually thought the Senate might represent, or what it might do, or.
Yeah, so it's a really complicated question. You can't figure out entirely, because I don't think Madison worked out the details, how he was going to model this. But I think one place to begin, and it's an important place to begin, is that Madison thought of the Senate, I think, not as a representative institution, but primarily as a deliberative one. Meaning he was much more concerned not with which entities, and it's not clear which entities he would identify, the Senate would embody or represent, but rather with its kind of institutional qualities, its characteristics, its capacity to deliberate. So Madison took very seriously the idea of bicameral government. There's a famous letter not on display, but that Madison writes in August 1785 to a college friend of his named Caleb Wallace about Republican constitutionalism, where the first item he discusses, Wallace lives in Kentucky, which is part of Virginia, was getting ready to break off, and he asks, Kentucky breaks off, what kind of constitution should we form? And so it's really the first occasion where Madison reflects actively on the constitutions written in the states, and his very first item is, what we really need is some device to provide wisdom and stability in legislation. And what he's thinking about is, well, Senate's not the only solution, but he's thinking about a set of proposals that will somehow improve both the quality of deliberation. Really what he means is making sure legislation is well conceived, that it's well thought, literally that it's well written, technically that it's well designed, well conceived, so it's understandable and comprehensible and therefore enforceable. And a big part of this was his idea of the Senate. So I think he holds to that idea pretty deeply. Down to 1787. The problem that arises at the convention is that Madison did not want a Senate elected by the state legislatures. I don't think he assumed that the Senate would necessarily represent all the states. Some delegates at the convention say openly that, discuss this point openly. They're kind of little asides made in their speeches, but it's clear that the idea that the Senate might not represent all the states was something they're still working with. But Madison and his chief ally in this, James Wilson from Pennsylvania, lose a critical point here very early in the convention. On June 7th, when they're like 10 days into debate, the convention votes very strongly to make the Senate elected by the state legislatures, which is going to make it hard not to represent the states individually.
Right. What did Madison think of his conception of the judiciary in the Virginia plan? Right. Did he hope and think that this would be a fairly strong body, or did he have suspicions of, just like Jefferson did, or what?
No, his suspicions were not as strong as Jefferson's. I think Jefferson was a lawyer, had been trained as a lawyer. I think had probably thought more deeply about what judges should do, though Jefferson says they should be mere machines. Madison read the law but did not practice it. I think also his views changed significantly over time. So to talk about this, you have to think about it really over a 30-year period. So I think Madison's starting position was that judges would be so politically weak in opposition or contrast to particularly the legislative branch that they wouldn't be very effective. that they would kind of lack the temerity or the nerves, whatever, to go up against a legislature which would have the voice of the people behind it. So he's somewhat skeptical about what they would do politically. Actually, interestingly, we didn't talk about this, but one proposal last night, or rather other places, so one proposal which Madison, along with James Wilson, was attached was the idea of the Council of Revision, which was based on the New York Constitution, which would mean the executive and some select members of the judiciary, probably the Supreme Court, would have an advisory role in the enactment of legislation. And Madison's position on this was that it's better, again, it goes back to his concern with the difficulties of getting legislation well drafted. It's great to say this for a group of congressional staffers who are privy to all kinds of secrets the rest of the citizenry don't know about these days. In any case, so Madison thought that there'd be kind of a trade-off, that it'd be much better to have judicial advice up front, ex ante, to improve the quality of legislation before it was enacted than to allow judges to deal with it constitutionally or otherwise after it had taken effect. But again, that's another of the pet proposals that's rejected. So I think as Madison's thinking about this, I mean, he does say in Federalist 39, it's almost a throwaway line near the very end, but it's a very important position that in matters of federalism, to enforce federal boundaries, the Constitution has established what he calls an impartial tribunal, which has to be the Supreme Court, and that it's going to resolve these kinds of controversies. And then I think over the next 30 years, if you go to the time of McCulloch versus Maryland, the famous bank case of 1819, I think Madison becomes more and more attached to that position. He starts with an assumption of judicial weakness. He doesn't really change that position in the 1790s because the Federalists control the judiciary, and the judiciary won't act the way he wanted to act. But I think even notwithstanding his differences with John Marshall, where his position's close to Jefferson, I think Madison comes to understand in a way that Jefferson is still somewhat angry about, that the Supreme Court, particularly if you're a Southerner, may remain the best bastion or the best resource for protecting Southern regional interests. So he holds that position from Federalist 39. Again, you have to read Federalist 39 carefully, get all the way to the end to see what Madison is arguing. But he likes that position, and the older he gets, the more he sticks to it.
Right. Moving very quickly, we know the Constitution had real trouble getting ratified in the state conventions, and the Federalists, including Madison, had to promise to pass a Bill of Rights to get the thing passed. The Bill of, we need 2 or 3 days rather than 5 minutes, but again, the audience ought to know that Madison was no great admirer of a Bill of Rights. Jack opened my eyes in an article, I think you published it in 1986, where you ran across the phrase, he called it a nauseous
project of amendments.
The Bill of Rights was a nauseous project. Why was that, Jack?
Why was that, Jack?
No, why did Madison believe that?
So he says this in a letter, while the Bill of Rights is pending in Congress in the summer of 1789. And I think what he means is it was nauseous to most of his colleagues. It wasn't nauseous to him personally. Okay. In fact, Madison thinks very carefully. He actually sets about solving what was a major problem in American constitutionalism, which there had been bills of rights back in 1776 when states started writing constitutions. But with a couple exceptions, they weren't really constitutional documents. They're more parallel documents that accompany the adoption of a constitution than legal protections that are specifically entrenched within the Constitution. So Madison thinks about that problem, and when the time comes to amend the federal Constitution, he wants to make sure that the rights to be protected should be understood not as statements of principle, but really as legal commands that ought to be enforceable. But the other side of this was that, once the Constitution was ratified, the changes that anti-federalists wanted to have made, they knew they weren't going to get. And this is where our late friend Pauline Mayer's book, Ratification, is really good in stressing it wasn't just about the Bill of Rights. The anti-federalists had a whole set of provisions they were attached to, including measures relating to taxation would probably be at the top of their list. So anti-federalists knew they weren't going to get what they wanted. Most Federalists said, we've just won the elections, we dominate the government. Anti-Federalists are more or less in disarray, though not in Virginia. So why do we really need to enforce that promise? I mean, it wasn't really a contract. It was kind of an agreement. Status wasn't really entrenched. Yeah. But I think Madison came to the conviction that to complete the whole process of ratification, there were a lot of well-meaning, perhaps somewhat misguided anti-federalists out there who felt very deeply about this issue. And if you wanted to get a kind of broad public acceptance of the Constitution as the government began operation, if you wanted kind of, in a sense, to complete the deal of ratification, to seal the deal of ratification, it would be great to kind of assuage, kind of placate a lot of their reservations. So he worked pretty hard. I mean, most members of Congress had other priorities, but Madison worked pretty hard from...
They ridiculed Madison, his own
Yeah, right.
yeah.
There was kind of Madison's project, and why is he wasting it? Fisher Ames thought the whole thing was a waste of time.
Yeah, yeah.
He also says about the Second Amendment that, I don't know how many will offend by saying this, but when he mentions the Second Amendment, or what becomes the Second Amendment, he says, he has the Latin phrase, risum teneatis amici, which means hold your laughter, friends. About its inclusion in the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
But Madison was committed to the overall project.
Right.
And, although it took 150 years for us to start taking the Bill of Rights all that seriously, on the whole, we think it's been good for us to have it.
Well, one of the Federalists, after it was passed, said it was good for nothing. Remember that, William Grayson?
Yeah.
Right. Anti-Federalist, sorry. So no one was really very happy with it. Given its exalted status today, it's quite a change. One interesting question came up last night. Madison and slavery.
What can I say about it?
Yeah. Well, I thought it was, especially because at the first session we had in these series, John Meacham severely arraigned Jefferson for moral failures and not doing not acting on something he had confessedly said was evil and wicked, and finally concluded that Jefferson didn't do that because it was too convenient to have slaves waiting on him. Yeah. What about Madison's view?
I think Madison and Jefferson are actually close in a number of ways. I think most of their ideas about slavery were fairly common. I do think, I explain this a lot to my students. One thing I want to say is, one could call Jefferson, or for that matter, Madison, a hypocrite. But, hypocrisy is not an explanation. It's not what historians do. To call somebody a hypocrite is not to explain their behavior. It's just to characterize it. So it's not adequate from our perspective to make sense of what they were doing or what they failed to do, to characterize or disparage them. So I think the deeper question is with Madison, I think as with Jefferson. I think there's no question that they had, kind of profound moral distaste with slavery. I think it made Madison very uncomfortable. Unlike Jefferson, Jefferson always in some ways, just wanted to be a planter. Idealized his life in Monticello, which would depend upon, having and exploiting slave labor. Madison becomes a planter only after he gets married and, when the estate passes to him and so on. So it's a role that comes to him rather than what he imagined himself doing. It's often said by Madison scholars that, one reason why he wanted to go north each year, or why he spends most time in Monticello reading, Montpelier reading, is he didn't really want to do this. So that's fine by itself. I think the deeper issue that one has to face with both Madison and Jefferson is that I think they took emancipation seriously. I think they felt it should be the destiny for American slaves, but it left open troubling questions. And I think the troubling question opens up, and it's hard for us to accept it these days, but historians have to try to root people in their own time, is if you emancipated the slaves, what would happen then? And I think the main problem is they're trying to imagine, or they could not imagine, how you could have a biracial society founded on Republican principles. That's the logic of colonization. That here you have a set of peoples whose history is in one sense intimately related, but which it's already been profoundly distorted. So Madison is very, he writes occasionally about slavery. I think some of his most important thoughts he keeps private. He writes in, I think, 1791, 1792, that he uses slavery as actually the best example of the factious majority. What better example could there be about how a minority can be exploited than to look at the racial status of slaves. But he does, he doesn't publicize those thoughts. And I think he's, if you guys get into the literature, Drew McCoy's book, The Last of the Fathers, is a wonderful treatment of Madison in retirement and how he thought about slavery and sectional questions, and in the 20 years he spends in Montpelier after he leaves the presidency.
Some questions from the audience. We
have a mic.
Yeah.
At the time that Madison and the founders were developing the architecture of government, the political entity of the United States didn't exist, and it required the consensus of the people who were going to live in it to come into existence. And I'm wondering what you think the effect of that volunteerism versus the power of government to exercise force had on the institutions of government as they created it, and how that would play out in a community which he knew would come into existence if the government came to existence, that had been raised with the organs and conception of America. In other words, they created America when America didn't exist, and they had to get consensus all the time to bring it into existence. But then the following generations would do it without be born into it, just like religion. And how would they balance that volunteerism which created America with the fact that you're brainwashed into it afterwards?
I
mean, just like religion, you're born into America versus creating America.
Well, so I think Madison is a Lockean and believes that religion is a matter we decide for ourselves individually as we grow more mature. So your question has deep philosophical resonance. It's hard to answer in a short order. So I'll offer one answer, which may or may not satisfy you. So I think one of the remarkable aspects of the adoption of the Constitution, and Madison, there's no doubt of Madison's instrumental importance in this, was the idea of how do you make a Constitution a Constitution? How do you turn it into supreme law? And try to say briefly to the congressman last night, towards the very end of our session, I think one of the most remarkable aspects of this process is the way in which the Constitution gets ratified from September 1787 to August 1788. That's to say, the whole mechanism of forming popular conventions, which will be elected not by the ordinary electorate. Actually, most of the states loosen the suffrage, the right to vote for delegates to the convention. In one state, the dissenting state of Rhode Island, they actually have a referendum. So I think that whole process, there are no examples of how you would do this. If you go to England in the mid-17th century, the time of the instrument of government, or the so-called the engagement, the English thought about more as signing a loyalty oath to abide by the government set up after Charles I was executed. The Americans actually come up without having any precedence at all, except maybe what's going on in Massachusetts. The Americans actually devised this wonderfully effective and very powerful mechanism for getting the Constitution ratified. And a big part of this, and this is something Madison theorizes, is you call, and it comes back actually to Jim's question about the Bill of Rights, you call state conventions into existence, and you say they represent the sovereign voice of the people. But when that sovereign voice speaks, it can say only one of two words. It can say yes, or it can say no. It has to take the Constitution in its entirety. When they did this in Massachusetts in 1780, they made a mess of it, because the convention says to the towns, okay, you have to approve the Constitution, but it doesn't tell them how they're going to do it. And when the convention comes back and they look at what we call the returns for the towns, they kind of read them all, and then they kind of throw their hands up in the air and say, well, it looks like it's ratified. Because there wasn't like a checkoff box to say, yes, we approve it. You get these disparate returns. So I think Madison thought that problem through. Now, your larger question, which I could not possibly deal with if I didn't have 2 or 3 days, involves the nature of consent over the long run, if I understood you correctly. That's so open-ended, I'm not going to go there. I'm just a Madison guy, and we're going to stay in the 1780s for now. But you can send me an email, I'll try to respond more fully.
And more, yeah.
Hi, my name is Gail Lillyveld. I'm a volunteer here. I also do research here. My question is on the Second Amendment, unless that's not doable in this context. A year ago, right after the Sandy Hook thing, online there was an article, lots of notes about the Second Amendment being propagated by Patrick Henry, because they were afraid that the well-organized militia brought up in the article of the first article of the Constitution might someday come along and take away their slaves. I don't know if I can say. What's the opinion?
I can discuss this in general. So I've done a lot, I've done a lot of work on this issue. I mean, I organized a group of historians, and I wrote a brief for DC versus Heller that actually Justice Stevens cited in dissent, and I actually think he relied more on our brief than the citation alone admits. So that's fine. Just one cite is enough, to be honest about it. But I feel very strongly, as a matter of historical argumentation, that the Second Amendment was about the militia for exactly the reasons you were intimating. It wasn't about a private right to bear arms for purposes of self-defense. It wasn't, as Justice Kennedy exclaimed in one of his enthusiastic moments, it wasn't about killing bears and Indians. That wasn't something you really needed to constitutionalize as a constitutional right. The debate with one or two exceptions, the debate in 1787, 88 was very much about the militia. Patrick Henry's concern was, and it's a kind of complicated issue, Henry's concern was that because Congress would now have a major oversight capacity in terms of organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and because they weren't confident that the states would commit the resources to maintain the militia, that the militia might atrophy as an institution, and if it did, this is the argument made about southern states, the southern states' capacity to be secure against, not so much against Indians as against slave rebellions, would be impaired. Of course, what's nutty about this is the militia would be a matter of what we call in federalism theory concurrent powers, an area of governance where the authority of the state and the authority of the national government overlap, where the states have the responsibility and the responsibility and the capacity to support the militia if they so choose, but what they do is subject to federal regulation. So that's kind of a short answer. I mean, that's, but for southern states, the slavery question is part of the discussion.
Yeah. Another question, please.
All right. I have two questions, in fact, concerning the Bill of Rights. What is the relation between Madison and George Mason? And the second question is, I'm a docent here, and I heard that there were a lot of other amendments on the floor, and beyond Amendment 3 to 12. Have you ever read the other hundreds, or were there any other that were significant for the story of the United States?
So there are a couple ways to answer that question. So when Madison drafts the amendments to the Constitution, they're not 100% about rights. There were a couple other structural things that he considered. So he relies on a pamphlet that was published, I think, in Richmond in November 1788, which lists all the amendments that the state ratification conventions had proposed. And those amendments were not limited to rights. Some of them were quite structural. Some of them relate to taxation, the point Pauline Mayer stressed in her book. Madison and other Federalists did not want to tamper with or alter the essential structure of the national government, the thing that they had worked out, at Philadelphia in 1787. So Madison purges the amendments he proposes of all those structural changes, except two minor ones. One, the original First Amendment related to the reapportionment issues. The original Second Amendment is now the 27th Amendment, which is, I've written an annotated, Harvard Press published a book I did called The Annotated U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence. And the end of my annotation is, the modern Constitution ends not with a bang or a whimper, but with a bad joke. and the bad joke is the idea that you could have an amendment circulating in the constitutional ether for 200 years, give or take, and then be ratified.
That was by Michigan in 1992, right?
Was the last state to ratify, yeah. But it comes, the real source is a guy from Texas named Gregory Watson, who came upon this subject as a college student at UT, and then he became an aide to the Texas legislature and got on the bandwagon and got the thing added. So anyhow, so Madison works for that list. So there were 2 amendments proposed that were not ratified, except one was ratified in our time, not theirs. It is a bad joke on the Constitution, to be honest, but it's a trivial clause, so it doesn't matter, I guess. Just the larger question, Madison's relation with the Mason, I go out to Gunston Hall a lot. I was just there last fall. If you guys haven't been there, everybody should go. But I think Madison and Washington get very fed up with Mason. You know, Mason was a very smart guy, but he's also kind of cranky. He had a strong ego concept. I think he gets a little irritated by the end of the convention. They're trying to placate him, but it doesn't work. So I think they're actually pretty annoyed with him for not, I mean, he's been a very active part of the convention. He's been very supportive of the general issue, but he gets his dander up on a few issues and decides to become an anti-federalist.
Yeah, didn't he say that he could write a Bill of Rights in a couple hours or something that at the end?
He probably been copying his own, copying the one he'd done for Virginia, which first thing Madison does, of course, is get that Bill of Rights significantly amended in the religion article.
Yeah.
For one last question.
One more.
At the end of his life, both Madison and Jefferson faced ruin. Can you talk a little about Madison's situation?
Well, it wasn't great, in the sense the Madison's situation was compounded by his stepson, who was, Dolly's surviving son from the yellow fever epidemic, who was, and I'm blanking on his first name now.
John Payne.
John Payne, who was a complete wastrel in the style that we've become so popular in the southern plantation South during the antebellum period. So that's factor number one. Factor number two is Jefferson describes Madison as America's most scientific farmer. So I think once he does become once he takes over the plantation from his father died in 1801. Once Madison takes over the plantation, and then of course once he goes there in retirement in 1817, he was a pretty serious farmer. So he's working hard to keep the enterprise going. But he and most other planters are they're locked into a kind of tobacco crop economy, which is no longer profitable. They do exist in this debt structure that had been a major part of the plantation economy since, if not since time immemorial, at least for a few generations. And fourth, of course, that leads to actually a scene that Drew McCoy talks about in his book, The Last of the Fathers, that slaves may well have understood that the death of the master might mean not only a change in the regime on the plantation, it might lead to its breaking up, which would have horrendous consequences for them, of course, because they have no security about the stability or the keeping their families together. So Susan Dunn's written about this book. I mean, a number of scholars have written about the breakup of the Upper South economy. That it's compared to rice and indigo in South Carolina, or cotton in the Great Cotton Kingdom. The Upper South's commercial, agricultural economy is fading and fading badly. Maybe not by the end of the 18th century, but certainly by the early 19th century. And Madison and Jefferson are part of that process. But then you have to it goes back to a question Jim asked earlier. Then you have to reflect on their position about slavery. Jefferson's case, because Jefferson is such a conspicuous consumer. Jefferson, given the choice between, Jefferson is kind of his endless projects of home improvement at, Monticello. Madison is pretty ambitious for Montpelier. By the way, since I'm on the board of Montpelier, you should all visit there and hopefully go, if you haven't been there recently, the house has been reconstructed back to Madison's period. The DuPont rooms were taken down. What you see now is a plantation. It looks much more like Madison's mature plantation. It's a great site, and for me it's a great place to go because, as I said last night, when you go there, it's, to my way of thinking, it's so completely isolated. It's only 100 miles from where we are now, or actually less than that, probably more like 75 miles from where we are now. So it's not that far away, except in the 18th century, it's kind of the middle of nowhere. And so to go there and think about Madison emerging from this plantation, to me is always, well, personally, it's kind of a moving experience because I associate my scholarship so strongly with his life and career. So,
Well, thanks very much, everybody. It was a good discussion.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.